YouTube, Ninja Midget here. This is going to be an assembly video for the Mossberg 151K. So this first part is going to be putting the cartridge stop and the cartridge stop spring, installing that on the feed tube. So you're going to need three parts: your cartridge stop, your cartridge stop spring, which is this little guy right here, and then of course your feeding tube. Now what you want to do, and this is tricky, I've never been able to do it on camera, so I'm just going to show the way this goes in. The spring goes in this orientation, right like this, and where these two posts are going, these two posts right here, there are little holes at the base of this, and let me get a light here. These two holes down in there, can't get a real good view of them, but there are two holes there, and that's where those two sides of that spring are going to go. So I'm going to fiddle around with this and get it on. I'll probably end up cutting most of it out because it usually is pretty tricky trying to get that on. Okay, so after you get the spring in like so, what you're going to want to do is, first of all, disconnector, because these aren't exactly machined to tight tolerances. I like to put a little anti-seize on here on all the areas that are going to be touching. It doesn't take a whole lot, just a little bit to make sure it's going to move in there for you. And then this is going to go right down over the spring. Let me get this on here. Going to just go in straight over the spring like this, and then what you're going to want to do is get a little screwdriver, and you're going to just lift that spring straight up until it gets over that, your cartridge stop, and then there's that all put together. Okay, so on to the next step. Okay, our next step here is going to be putting the bolt together. For this, you're going to need your firing pin, your retracting spring, your hammer spring, your hammer, your retracting rod, and your retracting rod plunger, as well as, of course, the bolt body and the pin that's going to hold it all together, and a toothpick. You'll see where that comes in. Okay, now I've already got my firing pin all greased up here. So the way this goes in is you're going to put it in from this side of the bolt up, and you got to have it in the right orientation. This angle matches this angle down here, so it goes in like this underneath these indents on the top, because that's what holds this captive. And then you get that in, and you can tilt it up, and there it is. It's captive now in there. Okay, so there we go. There's that. We'll go ahead and set that aside. That's ready for our next step. And what really helps with this, because it needs to be under spring tension, it's a little bit of a pain to line this hole up, and it helps to have these locking pliers. So you want to lightly lock them on here. You don't want to leave grooves on this. You're going to lightly lock that on there. Then the first thing that's going to go on is your plunger. Goes in this orientation. You're going to put on your retracting spring. You're going to put on your hammer spring. Over that, it goes over the plunger, and then you're going to put on your hammer, and your hammer goes in this orientation so that this sharp edge is facing this direction. It goes through there like that. Then you're going to want to set it inside your bolt and compress it all down, all the way down to the bottom, keeping in mind the orientation that you locked these pliers in. So the hole should be right about here right now. So wiggle it around a little bit. In goes your toothpick. Okay, from there you can just take off the locking pliers and go ahead and snip off the two sides of the toothpick that are protruding. You're going to want to take one side, doesn't matter which, push the toothpick in a little bit. There we go. And push it in just a little bit, and that's so that you can get your pin started in there. So you're going to want to get a little block like this. This makes it lots easier to do something like this. Get your pin. Get that started in there. Get your hammer. It's just going to knock that toothpick right out of there. May need to mess with it a little bit. Sometimes it doesn't want to go in straight away. But there you go. Not usually too much of a problem. There's your toothpick. So what you want to do is you're going to punch this down so that it's not protruding from either side. I'm going to make sure it's seated in there. Now it's not protruding from either side. It's got that rod captive. So there's your bolt assembly. Pretty simple, a little tricky to put together just because it does require a little bit of fiddling with and getting this together under spring tension. Using toothpicks really works well with this. So that's your bolt assembly. On to the next step. Okay. For this, we're going to put the stock all back together now. So we're going to need the feeding tube. We're going to need the trigger and the trigger spring, the trigger pin, the retentioning spring, and the screw that holds that, and of course your trigger guard and the two little screws that go with that. And not to forget the stock. So what we're going to do first is we are going to go ahead and put the trigger in. So for that, we need the trigger and the trigger pin. And this is very helpful. Trigger pin, trigger spring. Very helpful to have something like this, because what you're going to want to do, get the stock in view here. The trigger is going in like this. Trigger's facing this way, gun's facing this way. This is forward. So your trigger is going to go in like that. Your spring is going to go in this orientation. It's going to go in between these two parts of the trigger, and you're going to line it up with the hole, and then these little edges of the spring that are right here, that's what's going to give you your tension. Once you get this in, that's what's going to give you your spring tension to pull your trigger forward. So we're going to go ahead and move this up, and this is a little bit of a pain. What you're going to want to do is you're going to drop your trigger and your spring down in through the top, and you're going to grab your trigger on the bottom. Then you're going to go ahead and you're going to grab this little wood dowel that we're using, and you're going to try to line that up. It's kind of hard to do on camera. Oh, and my spring jumped out on me. So you got to try to get your spring back in place. Come on, there we go. It's a little hard to get that spring in place sometimes. Let me try from this side. Let's see here. There we go. Now that's on the spring. Once you get one side in, it's pretty easy to fiddle around and get the other side in, and there you go. Now that that's in, you go ahead and start tapping in your trigger pin, and it usually goes in pretty easy. You might have to wiggle around the trigger a little bit, but it tends to find its way in. Oops, come on, there we go. Tends to find its way in if you just wiggle it around a little bit. It's not usually too much of a problem. Now, to keep from marring up your stock, you want to make sure you don't hammer that all the way in with your hammer. Of course, you're going to take your punch that in so it's just underneath the surface of the wood, and there you go. It's great on both sides. Now this next part is tricky. It's not terribly difficult, especially if you have the right tool for it. And what I did was I made something. Let me get my focus here. Okay, this right here, this is just a dental tool that I bent around, and I have a little hook on there. And what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to reach through, and you're going to hook that spring with this. You're going to pull that all the way down to the bottom. And the idea is that your feeding tube goes in right through here, and your feeding tube is going to go through that spring as it's down there under spring tension, and it's going to go into the stock this way toward the back. So because it's kind of a pain, I'm not going to be able to do it on camera. I've tried, but this is where you're going to grab your feeding tube, and you're going to have that spring hooked, and then you're going to immediately grab your feeding tube and you're going to put it in there. So I'm going to try to do this. See if maybe I can manage to do it on camera this time. Wouldn't that be fun? Let's see. Bumping the camera. Come on. Come on, get in there. Get in there. Holy crap, I did it. Okay. So, I actually did that almost on camera. I'm not sure if that actually even ended up working out because I was too busy trying to fiddle around to see what was going on the screen. But there's your feeding tube in now. Make sure this is in there. There we go. Okay. There's your feeding tube that's in. Now, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to get your tensioning spring. There we go. Your tensioning spring is going to go in just like this, with this little lip up, because that is what's going to lock your this feeding tube in place. That holds it so that it maintains a good connection with the barrel and the receiver and everything when the gun is together. Oops, bumping the camera here. Okay, now that looks like it's pretty good. I have in the past had this thing kind of move out of place on me, and if that happens, you can just move it around a little bit, wiggle it, and you'll hear it snap back into place. You might have to loosen up the screw to relieve some tension, but that's your stock all together now. Went together a lot easier than I thought. I might have to cut out some of the fiddling around, see what I got on camera here, but that's your stock almost completely assembled. Getting a little ahead of myself here. We still have to put on our trigger guard, which I'm sure none of you out there in YouTube land could have figured that out on your own, right? Okay. But for the sake of being thorough, we'll go ahead and do this real quick. And the screw that's slightly longer goes in the front of the trigger guard. So tighten that down. The one that's slightly shorter goes to the rear. And there you go. Stock completely assembled except for your feeding tube. Your feeding tube needs to go in. There we go. Feeding tube in. Give it a twist. It's all locked. There's your stock all together. You're good to go. On to the next step. Okay, the last step in putting the rest of the gun together is, well, let's see what we're going to need. We're going to need the charging handle. We're going to need your disconnector, your breech plug, your sear and sear pin, your sear and disconnector spring, your disconnector and disconnector pin, your disconnector bracket, and the 2 screws that go with that, and your breech plug spring, and of course your assembled bolt. That's what you're going to need to get this done. Now, to start with, move our bolt, the other things we don't need out of the way right now, and and we're going to start with our ejector. And for the ejector, you're going to go ahead and go to the left side of the gun. It's easier for me if I have it in this orientation. And it goes in the slot just like this. I'm going to push it down flush. And now, to get this on, you usually want to give it a couple of medium hard taps because it wants to jump out on you as you're putting it in there, because it is under a little bit of spring tension. So you're going to want to get it started, give a couple good taps, and that gets it started. And then you can just tap it until that little lip seats in that groove. There you go. And that's installed. Okay, so now you're going to flip the gun over so you are working on the bottom of the gun. And what you're going to do next is you're going to grab your sear and your sear pin. Get this a little more orientated here. There we go. There's your sear and your sear pin. The sear goes in like this angle toward the back. Just drops right in. Your pin goes straight through, just like that. It's not a very tight fit. It just stays in place there when it's in the stock. Okay, so next what we're going to do is we're going to put our bracket on for our disconnector. The bracket for the disconnector goes with the short end forward, always forward. Long end goes back. So we're going to lay that on there. There's a little pin that it sits in. There's a pin on here that sits inside a little indentation there. And you're going to want to get your sear spring and your disconnector spring. And what you're going to do is you're going to lay it over this first hole. That first hole right there is where you want it. And then what you're going to want to do is get one of your screws It helps if your screwdriver is a little magnetized, because you can just, as it walks out on me, just get that in there so that you can get that screw started. And now, as you're tightening down this spring, this side will want to walk on you, the sear portion of the spring. It'll try to walk on you as you're tightening it, so just keep your hands on that and make sure it's centered in your on your sear. And there it is, all tightened down, works great. Okay, now your disconnector is going to go in like this. Just going to go in straight over your sear. Like this. And you're going to need to put a little bit of downward pressure on the back of your sear or your disconnector to get that pin in there. And then it's going to slide right through for you. You want it approximately centered. Okay. And there we have it. That is our disconnector and our sear functioning. Everything works great. Okay. Alright, so now what we can do is we can go ahead and put the bolt in. Put the bolt in, it goes with these machine sides up. Put a little bit of lubricant in here on these areas where the cartridge stop runs in here, as well as the disconnector does make some contact in here. So put a little grease in there, make sure it's functioning, and then you go ahead and slide that straight in, just like this, until you can see the hole down here. There we go. For your charging pin to go in. Set that down in there, move it forward. It's going to want to capture your hammer that first time, so you release your hammer. And I just realized I forgot to do one step on that. My bad. It's okay, we're not going to really need to undo anything, but I forgot that on the back side we need to do our little our breech plug spring. and that requires our second screw. So we go ahead and put this second screw for the bracket on the back here. If I can get it in, there we go. Tighten that down. That's your breech plug spring. Keeps tension on your breech plug, so it's not walking out on you as you're shooting. And there you go. You're going to go ahead and screw in your breech plug. And there we go. Alright, now, next step is nice and easy. We're going to go ahead and lay our stock down on top of our action. We're going to go ahead and grab a screwdriver so that we can do up this screw right here. That's going to hold your whole bolt and everything to your stock. There we go. Tighten her on down. There we go. And that is a gun that's completely assembled. Now we're going to go ahead and check our functionality. Trigger's functioning fine. Look at that. Everything works. There we go. Okay, so that is the completed reassembly of the Mossberg Model 151K. Not too terribly difficult. A couple areas where it's kind of, you gotta fiddle around with it a bit, but it's pretty decent to put together after you know what you're doing. So that's it. Thanks for watching.